They all laughed at his shack, said it looked like a chicken coop made by a drunk. But when the worst freeze in 10 years rolled in, folks started walking toward it like it was a church on fire. The first man to knock that morning had frost in his beard so thick it looked like he'd been dipped in milk. He didn't say his name, just clutched a bundled child in his arms and asked, "Yours the warm place?" Thomas didn't answer. He only moved aside and let them in. He never did like talking much, not when his words usually came back with a laugh stuck on their tail. Folks around the high basin called him Thomas the Carpenter, but not because of what he built. They meant it like a joke, like when you called the slow mule Lightning. It was a nickname that spread after one look at that lopsided shack he threw up on a slope of wind-blown rock 3 winters ago. Looked more like a forgotten tool shed than a home. Tin roofing patched with bark and canvas. Planks uneven, chinked with what looked like hay and horse dung. A stovepipe too short to smoke right. From the outside, it didn't promise warmth. It promised misery, a place for raccoons and ghosts, but the inside told a different tale. And now they were coming, one by one. No words, just knocking. That first man barely made it 2 steps inside before he sank to the floor with the child in his arms and let the warmth breathe into his bones. His skin, pale and stiff, steamed. The child, a girl maybe 4 or 5, coughed once and whimpered, and Thomas gave up his own quilt without a second thought. He'd been preparing for this week all winter. Everyone knew the freeze was coming, but nobody thought it would hit like this. Days before expected, dropping 30 degrees overnight with snow that blew sideways like nails from a gun. And no one, not even Thomas, expected it to last. The second visitor came limping, dragging his left boot through the snow like it weighed twice the other. The third came before dawn, cradling a tin of beans and a small dog that couldn't stop shaking. By noon, 6 people were inside Thomas's shack, and the small stove, fed with nothing more than a single log resting on hot coals, somehow kept every one of them from freezing. There was no magic to it. Thomas never claimed there was. Just stubborn planning, borrowed ideas, and the kind of lonely focus only a man with no one left can maintain. While others spent the summer building barns or getting into card fights, Thomas was digging. Not a root cellar, not a grave. Something deeper, more layered. He built inward, not upward, down and under. They all mocked the build, said it was dumb to waste time burying walls when you could be putting up strong timber instead. Said the cold would eat through that mud-packed wall like termites through pine. But Thomas had studied the old Norwegian books, the kind printed back in 1790s Wisconsin, from when those cold country immigrants tried to tame the North with moss and sod. And what they figured out was simple. If the earth couldn't be heated fast, then don't heat the earth. Insulate it from you. Let it keep its cold. Seal yourself inside a space where the ground's chills stayed still, and then make the air move. That was the trick nobody understood. The air. So when the 6th person finally asked, voice cracked from cold, how it was so warm, Thomas just pointed to the ceiling. There, woven into the low rafters, were narrow cloth tunnels stuffed with sheep's wool and canvas. They connected one corner to another, ran like veins. Some were half collapsed, some stitched again and again, but they moved the warm air in slow, rolling spirals. No metal, no fans, just principles of up and down. Heat rises, cold falls, give it a way to cycle, and the warmth won't gather in the corners and die. Built it that way from the start, Thomas finally muttered. Got laughed at from the start, too. The girl coughed again and nestled deeper in the quilt. She hadn't spoken a word since she came in. Neither had her father or uncle or whoever he was. Thomas didn't ask. He didn't need their stories. He just gave them space, told them where the buckets were, told them how the latrine worked, dug halfway under the shack's rear lean-to so they didn't have to venture far, told them not to block the intake holes near the floorboards. By the second night, there were 13 people in the shack, and no one had left. The stove, barely larger than a milk can, still burned the same log. That was the secret, see? Thomas didn't burn his logs, not all at once. He half-charred them ahead of time, low and slow over days in a separate trench, until they turned almost to coal, dry as bone but not cracked. Then he split each into 3, sealed them in lard-rubbed cloth, and kept them in a buried box lined with tin. When the time came, he placed one on a mesh grate over the coals and let the rest of the stove's architecture do the work. The coals did the burning. The log just gave the heat time. No flames, just a glow, a breath of warmth steady as a sleeping dog. That was all they needed. And somehow, for some reason, it worked. The townsfolk would never understand. They'd built their homes like fortresses, thick log walls, iron stoves burning red, smoke pouring all hours. And yet one by one their homes failed them, not because of cold air, but because of wind. The wind didn't knock at the door. It crawled through cracks. It squeezed past corners. It twisted up the flues and dragged smoke back into the rooms. The harder you fought it, the more it wanted in, and once it got in, even just a sliver, it turned everything inside against you. Pipes froze, bread spoiled, teeth chattered no matter how much wood you burned. Men sat up at night feeding fire like slaves to a dying king. But Thomas, he didn't fight the wind. He sealed it out. He made his shack smaller, lower, simpler until there was nowhere for it to squeeze. He planted hay bales between walls, wrapped the outside in snow-packed cloths, even stuffed old pants in the ceiling joints. His air wasn't clean, it was still, and still air is what saves you when you've got nothing but one log and no more coming. That third night a child died in the town. Word didn't travel fast in the snow, but it traveled hard. A rider came at dusk, his horse near collapse, shouting for help. He didn't knock on Thomas's door, he shouted from the edge of the slope. Thomas opened the door and stepped into the cold. "They say you've got space," the rider panted. "There's 5 more down the hill. Sick. Real bad. One's just a baby." Thomas looked behind him. 14 people now inside. Barely room to stretch a leg. The air was already thick with breath. But he didn't say no. He pointed to the long-handled shovel by the door. "Start digging. Other side of the hill. Dig down 4 feet. Bring canvas. We'll make another." The rider looked stunned. "Tonight?" Thomas nodded once. "Right now." And so they dug. In silence. In cold. In hope. The shack wasn't big enough. It never would be. But Thomas didn't build warmth into the walls. He built it into the idea, the shape, the flow, the air. It wasn't a miracle. It was math, mud, and misery. And now it had to save more than just him. By the time they finished digging, the wind had picked up so fierce that the canvas snapped like a gunshot every few seconds, and the snow whipped sideways in streaks that blinded your eyes the moment you looked up. Thomas didn't speak much through it. He dug with the same rhythm he did everything else. Slow, methodical, like time was measured in breaths, not minutes. The rider, who finally said his name was Frank, though Thomas never asked, tried to keep pace but fell behind more than once. The others from town hadn't come yet, too far, too cold. They'd said they'd wait for dawn, but dawn wasn't something you could wait for anymore. Not in this weather. It was dropping again, fast. The kind of cold that turned sweat to frost on your collar and made your ears ring without sound. They dug down to just past waist deep, then carved sideways, tunneling with hands and shovels, shaping the hollow like the belly of a canoe. Thomas's hands were red raw. Frank's started to bleed at the knuckles, but they didn't stop. Not when the frostbite was already creeping up the foot of every stranger still trapped down in that town. By midnight, the second shelter was framed, not with timber, but with whatever they had. Old bed slats, a cut door frame from Thomas's spare supply, some ragged sections of cloth, soaked in grease to slow the wind. No stove this time. Not yet. But Thomas left a coals bed in a lidded bucket near the back wall, the same way he'd learned from a man long gone who used to keep snakes warm in the canyon frost. Inside his shack, the people slept in shifts now. The girl and her father never left the far cot. The others curled near walls, over empty sacks, or leaning against each other in clumsy piles like half-frozen cattle. There was no privacy, no space for quiet grief, no softness, just breath and heat and human weight. By dawn, the baby had arrived, wrapped in 3 layers of cloth, and carried in a crate like a parcel. The mother couldn't speak. She had no voice left, just coughed in dry rasps as the frost melted from her eyebrows and soaked her shoulders. Thomas didn't ask names. He just waved toward the new dugout and told them where to go. Frank led them, and when the baby finally cried, weak but alive, the sound broke something in the air. For the first time in 3 days, someone smiled. It was a small thing, a crack at the corner of a face, but it was enough to make Thomas go back out, collect another half-charred log from his store box, and tuck it into the coals like a father laying down a child to sleep. The days blurred after that. No one knew what time it was anymore. The storm had swallowed the sky. The sun became a rumor. But they measured time by shifts: who tended the air tunnels, who shook the frost from the ceiling cloths, who wiped down the buckets. The shelters now held 23 souls, and all of them, whether they admitted it or not, had stopped laughing at Thomas's shack. The town tried to send word. A few men, the older ones who remembered the 1881 freeze, saddled up and pushed through the drifts toward the next valley over, hoping to send a telegraph or bring back blankets. But they never made it back. 2 days passed, then 3. The weather had trapped them all. The only thing left was to survive. Food ran low on the 5th night, not because of greed, but because most had brought nothing. The baby's mother hadn't eaten in 2 days. The old man in the corner hadn't moved for hours. Frank took off his coat and gave it to a child with purple fingers. The girl in the quilt had begun coughing again, harder now, deeper. Thomas stood outside that evening, facing the wind, wrapped in his oilskin like a man preparing for burial. He stared at the hills. No one could see his face. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he carried out the last 4 charred logs from his storage box and, laid them side by side in the snow. Each one represented a day of life, a day's worth of warmth. He'd built his system for conservation, not charity. He'd planned for himself and maybe one other, not 23. But something inside him refused to measure wood in days anymore. It had to last until the thaw, and the thaw wasn't coming soon. So he began to build again, this time not down, but out. He started with a trench between the two shelters, laid cloth through the bottom like a sleeve, stacked rocks on either side, packed it with dirt, frozen moss, and wool rags. It wasn't pretty, but when he finally sealed the trench with planks and dragged hot coals from the stove down into a pipe section he'd scavenged from the old mining equipment behind the ridge, something incredible happened. The warm air moved. It circulated between shelters. People noticed it in their sleep, a breath on the neck, a change in the way their toes felt. By morning, it was undeniable. The cold was held at bay, even in the new dugout. The girl's coughing eased. The baby slept. A man who'd been delirious from fever woke up, drank water, and asked where he was. Frank caught Thomas's eye across the trench. "You ever build for anyone else before?" he asked. Thomas shook his head. "Never had the reason." Frank looked around at the two dugouts, the shared trench, the rags strung like lifelines from one post to another. Then he nodded once, slow. "You do now." They kept arriving, not every day, not in groups, but one at a time, faces raw, bodies bent, footsteps slow like ghosts drifting through fog. Some came carrying nothing. Some came with a single item, a torn blanket, a pouch of cornmeal, a photograph. Thomas never asked. He just opened the door or lifted the canvas or pointed to where the warmth would be. By the 10th day, there were 35 people across 3 dugouts. Some slept in the main shack, some in the trench tunnel, curled near the warm duct. And still the wind blew, still the snow fell. On the 12th day, a boy died, not from cold, from an old infection. His mother never cried. She just held him for hours and then helped bury him in the snowbank beyond the slope, wrapping his body in a burlap sack, marking the spot with a half-burned plank. She asked Thomas for a stone. He gave her one from the inside of the shack, the stone he used to prop his cooking pot. No one ate that night, not out of grief, out of fear. Because the cold wasn't just freezing their fingers anymore. It was reaching in, testing their faith, testing their silence. There was talk of leaving, of trying for town again, of abandoning the shelters and betting on motion. But Thomas stopped them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten or plead. He just unwrapped his hands, red, blistered, shaking, and showed them what he'd built. The coals, the ducts, the insulation, the tunnel that ran between all 3 shelters, connecting them like veins. He showed them how to breathe with the space, how to work the air with cloth and weight, how to listen to the creaks, the shifts, the way the snow compressed. "This place isn't warm because of a stove," he said. "It's warm because we made it together." Then he stepped back and let the silence answer. No one left that night. No one left the next either. They started helping more after that, building windbreaks, layering walls, creating signal flags to find the shelter in whiteout conditions. They even wrote names on boards inside the dugouts, not as claims but as prayers. So if they were found frozen, someone would know who was who. Thomas carved his name last, not for pride, for ownership, not of the people, of the responsibility. That week, something changed, not in the weather, in the people. They started calling it Thomas's Ridge, and none of them laughed. The 13th night came with no warning, no howl, no sudden shift in the wind, just a silence too thick to breathe through, the kind that settled over the valley like a lid. Even the snow paused, suspended in air like flakes didn't know how to fall anymore. Inside the shelters, the air had thinned to the sort of dry that cracked lips and made the skin around your eyes peel. The dugouts still held warmth, barely, but it felt like the earth itself had stopped pulsing. People whispered that the freeze had reached its worst, like it was a living thing that had drawn breath and now waited, still to see who'd survive it. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He walked the tunnel trench in a steady loop, checking airflow, brushing frost from the hanging cloths, pressing a bare palm to the duct joints. His knuckles bled in tiny lines, his shoulders sagged from days without real rest. But he moved, because if he didn't, if he stopped, then everything stopped. There were 42 people now, 3 dugouts, and the main shack, connected by a haphazard spiderweb of tunnels, trenches, and ducts. A 4th shelter had been started just 2 days ago, further down the slope, where the wind was slightly less sharp. It wasn't finished. It couldn't be yet. The supplies were running thin. The wool had all been used. The last of the good cloth had been shredded into draft stoppers. Even the food reserves, painstakingly rationed, were near gone. On the morning of the 14th day, a group of 3 arrived from the East Pass. 2 men and a woman, their faces wrapped in oilcloth and eyes swollen near shut from cold exposure. They carried nothing but a wrapped parcel the size of a toolbox. It wasn't food, it wasn't medicine, it was lumber. Not a lot, just 6 planks, and 2 lengths of iron duct, cut from the remnants of a collapsed stable miles away. They hadn't even intended to come to Thomas. They'd been looking for shelter, and the trail brought them west. But when they saw the network of dugouts, the low chimneys breathing barely a whisper of smoke, and the narrow tunnel trench that snaked between snow-packed walls, like the root of a stubborn plant, they knew they'd found something different, something that had been built. Thomas took the lumber without thanks or complaint. He carried it straight to the 4th shelter and began measuring lengths against the trench mouth. Frank came to help without being asked. By now, Frank had become something of a right hand, the only one Thomas shared glances with when something needed saying without words. It had become a rhythm, this strange ritual of quiet building, of whispered coordination, like a choir too cold to sing. But the melody held, and the structures, patched and strange as they were, kept the warmth, not like a stove, not like a hearth, but like the inside of a coat held close to the chest. The heat didn't pour, it lingered, stayed low, moved slow, hugged the floor and licked at knees and hands. The air always smelled faintly of oil and wet wool, but no one minded. It was better than smoke, better than death. That same day, 2 children from the first dugout started vomiting. No fever, no visible signs of sickness, but they were weak, and it came quick. Thomas listened to their mother explain it, voice brittle, eyes already resigned, and walked into the shack alone. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he took down a tin from his wall shelf. Inside was ground white root, dried moss powder, and a pinch of crushed juniper. It wasn't medicine, not the way doctors thought, but it had kept him alive through a stomach plague back when he wintered in the South Hills. He handed it to the mother and told her to mix it with water. She nodded once and left. He didn't expect it to work, but it did. The next morning, both children were sitting up, pale but awake, eating soaked oats from a shared tin. Someone called it a miracle. Thomas didn't respond, because he knew better than to pretend any of this was a miracle. It was luck and math and a kind of miserable persistence that lived in his bones now. He hadn't always been alone. He didn't talk about her, not even to Frank. But there'd been a woman once, a long time ago, before the shack, before the valley, before the snow felt like a natural state. She'd liked warm places, liked small cabins and baked things. She'd laughed at his plans for earth-heated walls, said it sounded like a mole's idea of comfort. But she'd helped build it anyway, at least the first version. A hut that half collapsed during a thaw one year. She was gone before this one, gone before the wood was seasoned, before the ducts were shaped, cancer or fever. Thomas never said, just stopped talking altogether for a year. But sometimes, when the wind rose, and the shelter walls thumped like a heart, he swore he could still hear her humming in the ductwork, that slow, tuneless hum she used when mending fabric or peeling potatoes. He'd built this place for her, even if she never saw it finished. Now it was saving dozens of strangers. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what she would have wanted. On the 15th night, someone tried to steal, not from Thomas, from the baby's mother. She'd hidden a can of condensed milk deep in her belongings, tucked inside a rolled cloth, meant for emergencies only. One of the younger boys, not hers, found it. He took it, hid it in his cot and waited for night. But someone saw, and someone else whispered, and within an hour the boy was dragged from his bed, milk tin in hand, shivering, not from cold but from shame. They brought him to Thomas. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't grab the boy, just looked at him for a long time, then nodded. "Dig," the boy blinked. "What? You took something without asking," Thomas said, "so earn back what you owe." And he handed the boy a shovel. That night, the boy dug the first foot of what would become the 5th shelter. And when he was done, Thomas gave him a strip of dried meat and told him to sleep near the stove. Not as punishment, as reminder. This wasn't a jail. It wasn't a church. It wasn't a town. It was survival. And survival didn't leave room for pettiness. It wasn't about being right. It was about enduring. After that, the boy never stole again. He dug every day after that. And he wasn't alone, because people started to believe. Not in magic, not in Thomas, in each other. They started organizing shifts. One man stayed up each night to monitor airflow. 2 women took turns distributing food. Frank became the informal surgeon, thanks to a steady hand and a calm voice. The baby, whose name was finally revealed as Ruth, had stopped crying and now slept so still at night that people sometimes checked her chest just to be sure. And then, one morning, sunlight. It came sudden, golden, brutal, like a slap to the face. People stepped out of the dugouts like ghosts from a crypt, blinking, holding each other's hands. Snow still covered everything, but the sky was blue, clear, so bright it made their teeth ache. The wind was gone, and with it, the worst had passed. But Thomas didn't smile, because he knew what came next. The thaw, and with it, collapse. The same snow-packed walls that had insulated them would now melt. The roofs would sag. The ducts would warp. Water would find seams. Mold would creep. The shelters had been built built for the freeze, not for what came after. So once again, Thomas started building, this time with rock. He sent groups to the ridge to gather stone. They stacked it in rings, packed it with clay, braced it with what wood remained. They dug drainage ditches. They reinforced tunnel ceilings with woven branches. And as the ice began to recede and the ground softened, the structures held. Not all, but enough. They'd survived the worst winter in a decade, and they'd done it in a shack they all once mocked. Frank stood beside Thomas on the 18th morning, both men watching steam rise from the coals outside the original stove. They hadn't burned more than a dozen full logs the entire time. Every bit had been stretched, every ember used, and they still had 2 logs left, wrapped in cloth, sealed in lard. Could have built something big with all this, Frank said. A whole town even. Thomas didn't answer right away. He just looked at the shack, patched, ugly, half sunk into the earth, wrapped in cloth and stone and stained with smoke. Then he looked at the people, 42 strong, alive, scarred but standing, and nodded once. We did. The thaw came with a sound, not a whisper or trickle, but a deep, unsettling groan that rose from the earth like something buried too long was waking up. The ice in the cracks began to split. Icicles hanging from the dugout beams shuddered, wept, then fell in slivers sharp enough to pierce a boot. The snow, which had once insulated and protected them, now became their enemy again, not in cold, but in weight, in water, in slow destruction. It crept in first as dampness in the seams, then as rot in the wool-stuffed tunnel ceilings, and finally as the collapse of the first trench wall, the main one between the original shack and the second dugout, which gave way in the night with a muffled crunch that sent half the shelter's side wall inward. No one died, but it shook them. Thomas stood in the aftermath, ankle-deep in wet clay, his hand pressed to the half-toppled duct line. Frank helped brace the wall with a branch, while the others, most still in their makeshift bedding, watched from the tunnel mouth in silence. "We got too used to the cold holding things still," Frank said. Thomas didn't nod, didn't blink, just muttered, "It's the warmth that unravels everything." They spent the next 12 hours reinforcing every line of the system, replacing cloth with rawhide where they could, trenching ditches around the dugouts to pull away the water, and repacking seams with a slurry of clay, grass, and pulverized ash. It was dirty, desperate work, but the kind that kept people focused, gave them hands busy enough to keep from thinking about the future too hard. Because no one really knew what came next. The town hadn't sent word. The road to the next settlement was still impassable. The horses, those that hadn't perished, were in no shape to ride. They were alive, yes, but they were also marooned. And the shack, the one they had mocked, that had somehow kept them alive, now felt like the last outpost of something sacred and doomed at the same time. In the following days, more changes came. The 5th dugout finally became habitable, just in time too, as another family was discovered stumbling through the high pass. A man, his brother, and 2 young women, all frostbitten, the older man nearly delusional. They'd tried to make it back to town from a hunting cabin, and lost their bearings in the whiteout. One of the girls had burns on her legs from sleeping too close to a spilled lantern. Thomas didn't ask for their story. He just laid them in the dry side of the new shelter, covered their feet with sheep's wool, and told them to sleep until they woke up on their own. What little medicine was left had to be divided carefully. Frank handled most of that now, using snow-cooled water for fevers, tight cloth bandages made from ripped coats, and a paste of pine sap and dried plantain for wounds. He never claimed to be a doctor, just a man who'd learned how to keep his own father from losing a leg in a logging accident 20 years ago. But in that place, among those people, his hands were trusted, and trust was the only currency left. On the 22nd day, the baby's mother collapsed while sweeping the trench tunnel. She'd been walking for hours, refusing help, insisting she was strong enough. But her body said otherwise. When they pulled back her coat, they saw the truth. Her ribs were too sharp. Her arms had thinned. She'd been giving her food to the baby. She survived, barely. But that moment cut through the camp like a blade. They'd survived the freeze, but they were starving now. Even with rationing, with shared meals and foraged roots and a few snares Thomas had set during breaks in the wind, it wasn't enough. 47 people, 5 shelters, and no clear path out. That night, a meeting was called. It wasn't formal, no stage, no speeches, just a circle around the coals near the main shack, faces dimly lit, eyes hollow but alive. They all looked to Thomas, not because he demanded it, but because there was no one else who had built something from nothing and made it last. He didn't give them hope, he gave them facts. "We've got 3 days of food, maybe 4 if we stretch it. If it thaws enough, we can try the trail back down. But the river's rising. If the bridge is gone, we'll have to climb the east slope, and half of you won't make it." Someone asked if they should try to hunt. Thomas shook his head. "Snow's still too deep. No sign of elk, no prints. We'd lose more than we'd gain." Another voice asked, "What if we just stay until someone comes?" Thomas looked at them all, the mothers, the old man, the boy who once stole, Frank, the baby's mother, now asleep in the dugout. Then we keep doing what we've been doing, one foot after the other, and we don't break. Frank stepped up beside him. He'd shaved that morning, using a shard of mirror and melted snow. His face was sunken but steady. We got through worse. This is just waiting. No one cheered, but no one left either. And in that silence, they made a choice, not to escape, to endure. On the 23rd day, the scouts came. 2 men from the valley, sent up the slope by the mare once the thaw broke. They found the shelters by following the thin trickles of smoke and the tracks of someone who'd tried to set snares near the ridge. They didn't recognize the place at first. "This is Thomas's shack?" one of them asked, blinking. Thomas didn't answer. He was dragging a branch across the tunnel roof, clearing off the melting snow before it could cave the whole thing in. When they saw the people, the ones still alive, still standing, still warm, they dropped their packs and stared. The scouts had brought bread, jerky, dried beans, a note from the mayor. It read, "Heard you were dead. Thank God we were wrong. You saved them. We'll send a wagon by tomorrow." "Hold on." Thomas didn't smile. He just rolled the note and used it to restart the coals in the 5th stove. The wagon came the next day. 3 horses, 2 volunteers, a dozen blankets, and then another wagon the day after that. By the 26th day, people began to leave. Not all at once, not in a rush, just 1 or 2 at a time. Families reuniting, mothers carrying children. The old man helped up into a cart by 3 hands. Each one stopped before they left, looked at Thomas. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. Sometimes they cried. He never said much back, because there wasn't anything to say. He hadn't done it for thanks. He hadn't done it for redemption. He'd done it because it had to be done. Because if you know how to make something warm, something safe, you do it, even if they laugh, even if they mock, even if they call it ridiculous. That night, Thomas sat on the step of the shack, his shack, alone again. The coals in the stove still glowed. A single log burned inside, one he hadn't planned on using, but now it wasn't a ration. It was a reminder. The shack, patched, warped, half submerged in clay and soot, stood like a scar against the snow, stubborn and battered and alive. And in the distance, he saw something he hadn't seen in months. Spring. The first thing to melt wasn't the snow, it was the silence. After the wagons came, after the children stopped crying in their sleep, and the mothers let themselves sleep more than an hour at a time, people began talking again, not in whispers, not just out of necessity, but in full-throated voices that carried. The valley echoed with something it hadn't known in weeks. Laughter. Barked, nervous, unbelieving laughter. The kind that didn't know where else to go, but up into the sky now that death had passed over and moved on. The thaw was messy. The hills turned to mud. The trenches collapsed and had to be filled in with rock and broken planks. The tunnels, which had kept them alive in the dead of winter, began to drip and swell and pull apart at the seams. One even caved in during a warm spell, but no one was inside. The air stopped holding its stillness. Now it moved like a wet cloth dragged over skin, damp, mild, oddly heavy. By the time the town mayor himself rode up with the 3rd supply wagon, the shelters had already begun to decay. But the people, they didn't. They stood, they rebuilt, they started tearing down the soggy sections and shoring up the ones still dry. A few even started to lay real foundations near the creek, talking about starting cabins by summer. Plans were made, tools were lent, and the phrase Thomas's Ridge stopped being something said in hushed gratitude and became something real, a location, a place you could point to on a map, a place that meant something. But Thomas didn't build cabins. He didn't stake a claim or draw up blueprints. He didn't go into town to receive his medal. Yes, the mayor made one out of old brass coins and called it a citizen's star. They wanted to give it to him at a community gathering in the schoolhouse. He never showed. He stayed at the shack. He rebuilt the roof, slower this time. No hurry. He patched the walls with bark again. This time, though, he added a second door on the windward side, not because he needed it, but because it would let him take in more people should it ever come to that again. He restocked the lard box, rewrapped his coals, collected new moss for duct insulation, and repacked the stones lining the stove vent. Because the thing no one else understood was that the warmth wasn't the miracle. The system, the whole ridiculous contraption of breath and flow and buried air, that wasn't the miracle either. The miracle was that a man who had lost everything had chosen to build something that served everyone else, when it would have been easier to disappear. The last of the families left by mid-April. Spring was fully on the land now, the trees waking up with buds and sap. The creek ran high and fast, swollen with meltwater. The town, just 3 miles off, was mostly dug out and restored. The general store had reopened. Mail had come. Names were read aloud from a list of the presumed dead, and then crossed off when the town realized they had all, in one form or another, been saved by a shack on a ridge that was never meant to last. That list, penciled and worn, eventually made its way into the hands of a man from the state office. He came out weeks later with a small notebook and a tired mule, asked questions, took notes. Then he walked up to the shack, found Thomas sanding a strip of bark into insulation cord, and introduced himself. "Name's Bennett, State Board of Reclamation." Thomas just grunted. Bennett squinted at the shack. "This the place?" Thomas nodded once. 47 people, they tell me, lived here. 5 shelters, all yours?" Thomas went back to sanding. Bennett cleared his throat. "You built it all yourself?" Thomas didn't look up. "Some of it. They said you burned a single log. Is that true?" Thomas paused, then chuckled, a dry sound, half breath. "That part they got wrong." "Oh, I burned 12, but only one at a time." Bennett wrote that down like it mattered. He asked a few more questions, then left without ceremony. Thomas never heard from him again. Months passed. The shack remained. Not pristine, not even good, but steady. Word got out. A few folks from neighboring valleys rode up to see it. The miracle shack. They'd take off their hats when they stood in the main room, amazed at the thickness of the air, at how even in spring the temperature stayed steady. Some tried to draw diagrams. One man asked if he could replicate the design. Thomas said, "I'd prefer you didn't." The man blinked. "Why not?" "Because it only works if you build it with your own hands. Anything else will fall apart." The man left angry. Thomas didn't care. Frank stayed. He didn't return to his cabin in town. Said it had too many bad memories. Said the view on the ridge was better. He built a lean-to beside the 5th dugout and reinforced it with old planks and a stolen church bell that had cracked in the frost. He'd ring it once every week, not as a call to worship, but as a reminder. The people in town started calling that Sunday bell the Shackman's Toll. No one laughed at the name. Not anymore. The mayor came again in late May, asking if Thomas would consider speaking to the community, maybe at the 4th of July festival. Said it'd mean a lot, said it would inspire folks. Thomas said, "I ain't a story." The mayor tried again. "But they look up to you now. You're the ridge man, the one who kept 'em warm." Thomas finally stood up, brushed sawdust from his trousers, and looked the mayor in the eye. "I didn't keep 'em warm, they did. All I gave 'em was something not to freeze in." The mayor didn't argue, just tipped his hat and rode back down the slope. The shack remains to this day. It doesn't get visitors often anymore, but those who remember that winter still nod in its direction when they pass the ridge trail. Some leave small offerings by the stone chimney, bits of cord, charred wood, fabric, not as superstition, as memory. Every so often, a child will ask, "Why is that house built like that?" And someone will answer, "Because one man built it when everyone else laughed." And someone else will say, "And when they stopped laughing, they stayed alive." And the child will pause, will look again, will wonder. Inside the shack, Thomas still tends the stove, still layers moss in the walls when the cold creeps in, still keeps one log burning. Just one, always one, not because he expects another freeze, but because he knows the cold never really leaves. It waits, and when it returns, someone will need a place to knock. He'll be ready, and the shack will hold.